Before the start of today's episode, I'd like to tell you about my very first virtual podcast karaoke coming up on Sunday, April 16th from 3 to 5 p.m. Eastern Time. If you're a regular listener of the Everything is a Primary Source podcast, then you know I record short episodes when I'm out at tap rooms, museums, stores, and festivals, and audience members stop by my table and select a pop culture artifact to talk about. If you have a movie, TV show, toy, game, food, fashion, album, anything pop culture that you want to talk about, send me an email at epspodcasthost@gmail.com or track me down on social media and we'll set up a time for our talk. Hope to see you virtually soon. If there's anyone who gets me and the Everything is a Primary Source mindset, it is Jeremy Ebersol and the Society for Commercial Archaeology, or SCA. Their mission is to locate, study, and preserve roadside America so that the clues about the country's commercial past don't fade away silently. I was glowing with excitement to have Jeremy join the Everything is a Primary Source podcast to talk and dissect one of the most recognizable 20th century roadside features, neon. And just like everything else out there, when analyzed the way we do at the EPS Podcast, neon highlights a very vibrant history of an economy growing up and down the social ladder throughout the 20th century. I'd like to welcome you back to the Everything is a Primary Source podcast. I'm Eric Paul, and today I'm being joined by Jeremy Ebersol of the Society for Commercial Archaeology, and the SCA for short. And in just a few minutes, we're going to start talking about neon. But first, I would like to, first of all, welcome you to the show, but also get a feel for what the SCA is all about. So welcome to the EPS podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much, Eric. It's really, really wonderful to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat. And the SCA, Society for Commercial Archaeology, I'm fortunate to be on the board of directors there, going on my 8th year, I believe. But we are, despite the name archaeology, the concept of commercial archaeology, based on another organization, the Society for Industrial Archaeology, and the idea being not that we're digging in the ground for fossils or dinosaur bones or old pottery shards, but the idea of archaeology as a way to explore and understand the past and cultural history, cultural heritage, and kind of what these physical remnants of things that have come before us can tell us about society and culture. And so we often talk about commercial archaeology as above ground archaeology. So that is kind of the academic way of explaining it. But what we actually do is we're a group of people who love neon signs and commercial buildings and roadside architecture of all kinds. The organization was started in the late 1970s, originally in New England, here where I know you are, and I am in Vermont myself. And we actually started in Vermont. There was a professor who ran the historic preservation program at the University of Vermont in the late 70s, and was really interested in the preservation, especially early on, of diners and gas stations and some of these other roadside buildings that really were not given much attention at all in the preservation or architecture community at the time, and a group of people who said these places are important and valuable, and we need to start thinking about what they tell us about society and preserving them. And so that kind of led to the formation of the organization in the 70s. And since then, we've kind of become the national preservation organization for roadside architecture. And we do a number of events and publications. We have a great website at SCA-roadside.org. We're a membership organization, and we have 2 great magazines that come out every year, and a number of printed newsletters that come out with news on what's happening with signs and old gas stations and amusement parks and these types of things around the country. We have a monthly Zoom presentation that's free for all of our members. We just had very recently someone from American Giants was talking, and they they talked to us about the history of muffler men and other roadside giants, these tall fiberglass figures that you see on Route 66 and on kind of the side of the road. And then we do conferences every year as well, conferences and tours each year, one a year. And we're coming up in June, headed to Western Pennsylvania, based out of Erie, PA, where we're going to be exploring that area and going out to Cleveland as well to visit the Christmas Story House in Cleveland. And we eat lots of diner food and explore roadside places on these conferences. So
I love it. I love it all because it's Americana, and it's almost like there's a sense in the last, I don't know, 40 years, maybe a little bit less, of people being like, is it okay to consider this history? Is this okay to consider stuff that was made in the mid 20th century as, the past? I'm like, yes, it is, because it is the past, and it deserves the same kind of attention. It's sort of like the idea of, when does technology arrive in fine art? When is it when artists are painting railroads and telephone lines instead of avoiding them, incorporating them into the landscape? And it's like, these things have been part of our actual landscape for the better part of a century now, if not longer.
Yeah.
Would you say is there a section of the country, because nowhere is devoid of these kinds of above ground, I love that term, above ground archaeology. But is there a place that it's kind of lighter, on the lighter side than, because like you mentioned Route 66, the Southwest, such a modern part of the country anyway, of course it has those kinds of roadside attractions. Is there a part of the country that it's like, it doesn't seem like it's quite as noticeable?
Yeah. I mean, to your point, I mean, it is everywhere. There does tend to, in the popular imagination, I mean, it is probably more associated with places like the West, California, Route 66, and a lot of that is because roadside architecture, as we think about it now, depends on the road and people driving on the road, and so these are places where the development and infrastructure, the tourist infrastructure and such, is coming around later on and more concurrent with the roadside, with people driving. Essentially, there's more space to build these types of attractions that are designed to catch the motorist in places where there is more space.
So it almost seems like that's like similar to the story of Route 66 itself. Is like that showed up as part of the U.S. highways in the late 20s, and was developed in the 30s, but it didn't have that long of a lifespan, because before you knew it, it was the interstate showing up. Whereas in New England and up and down the East Coast, you have it's the same U.S. highway system, but Route 1 is essentially the post road, that dates all the way back to colonial times. So of course it's much more lived in, and all sorts of different forms of transportation plied that road. Well, basically like two, but before they got, whereas it's like 66 was a car road, and then the interstates are better car roads, so that's why it's like has all that such a car centric part of the country.
Exactly. Yeah. And to that point, I think if there is an area where maybe there's less as far as what we think of now as kind of roadside attractions, it probably is the Northeast, because this is where their space was already filled up here, and some of his conscious decisions. I mean, that we made as societies in New England to restore things to a specific time period. Like our image is going to be 1700s and 1800s, and place. I used to live in Salem, Massachusetts. I love fabulous city. Lots of great history. I see pictures of Salem, and this is the case of many other places as well. In the 50s and 60s, neon everywhere in Salem during that time. Now there's almost none because cities, especially during Tuka, made a decision and said, we want to present an image of being colonial and what people want to see when they come to New England, which they did not think was things like neon signs. And so all of that stuff was ripped out.
Salem with like neon signs, it's like witches, you know, like blinking back and forth, all night.
Yes. You can use neon to advertise anything. It's true.
it's wild. So, I'm fascinated. I love the mission of what you do. And I love the, I don't want to say like super serious as in like everybody just sitting there like, you know, all the time, but, giving those roadside features the same dignity, the same kind of consideration that you would anything else. Sounds kind of familiar. You know, I've done something similar to that, you know, with the podcast, as far as, you know, saying, okay, you can drive past it a million times in this case and never think twice about it. But if you do scrutinize it for just a little while, you'll learn something about the society. And I think it's interesting that somebody from Vermont is behind it because I don't know how recent it is, but I know Vermont stands out as one of the only states that doesn't allow for billboards on their interstates. They don't allow that kind of advertising. And they always make it a point to say it's the only state capital, Montpelier, to not have a McDonald's. So it's almost like they're pushing against, like, you know, as a society. And there's like one professor in Vermont be like, hey, back in the 70s, like, you know, let's not forget this stuff. You know, we're part of the same story.
Yeah. And it was a lot of diner. And that's one thing we do have in New England is these old diners that were transported on rail cars, and people think they were rail car. They weren't actually rail cars, but they were meant to be the shape that they could be transported on rail cars, and these early lunch carts and things that we have all over upper New England. And so that was part of the original impetus for the organization, and kind of grew. But as you said, that I can talk when we talk about neon signs, but that beautification, which Vermont has done, quote unquote, better than almost anywhere else in not allowing billboards. I think it's Vermont, Maine, and maybe Hawaii or Alaska that don't allow billboards. But that's the reason why we don't have many neon signs in lots of places.
So let's talk about neon, because I think of all the things I've ever covered on this show, I think it's one in which the material we can actually approach literally. I'm curious, you know, because a lot of times I'm like, it's figurative. It's like the material behind Batman is comic books, you know, whereas the material for neon, that probably says something about the time period in which it first started being used. What is neon, especially neon lights? What is neon made out of? It's
surprisingly simple. I mean, we talk about neon signs. Well, obviously the reason that we call them neon is because they are, it's a gas. Neon is a gas. It is one of the elements. It's one of the noble gases, which I just love that terminology, noble, because it is one of the gases that lights up when electrified, essentially, which is the where the name noble comes from. And these gases were all discovered in the late 1800s. And before I get into a big history lesson, the quick answer is neon they're made out of gas, glass, electrodes, and electricity, essentially. So a neon light is really just a glass tube that is warmed and bent by a skilled artisan into a particular shape. You put electrodes at the end, you create a vacuum inside, and then you send the gas into there, and you put the gas in the vacuum, and then you send electricity through it, and that creates a light when the gas is electrified in a vacuum, essentially. So it's quite simple. And then if you're making a sign, obviously you just put that onto a metal sign, and you might add metal in there, but it's quite simple and not always neon. The things that we call neon pure neon lights up red, so that kind of the red color that we often associate with neon signs is just pure neon. But obviously, we see different colors of neon signs. We get that from different kinds of gases. So the blue is argon. And then you can add in mercury or other things to get different shades of color. You can use tinted glass. You can paint the glass, and so you can get all these different colors out of it. But it's really just a couple of simple ingredients.
And you would say that most of them are probably individually made. I know that there's like the open one, like certain terms are like are applicable to pretty much all businesses, but they're probably individually made by an artisan, right? Somebody knows how to work the tubes and the glass and everything.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially today. I mean, the neon sign making just a couple years ago was named in the UK by I forget the organization, British Heritage Craft Association, something to that effect, named it as an endangered craft in the UK, because there are so few people doing the work now. And if such an organization, I don't know that exists in the US, but it certainly is just as endangered here. But yes, it is a craft. Neon tube bending is really the part that requires an incredible amount of skill, and like lots of trades, and it's something that takes, from what I understand, about 7 years of working to really master and get to a point where you can really do this kind of work commercially and effectively. So yes, it's done by individuals using their hands, using flames to bend the glass into particular shapes, and everyone is individually made. Now, of course, when there was a lot more neon being made, this work was being done in large factories with multiple neon artisans doing this work. But it's still all made by by hand, by people. So yeah, it is, and that's something I think that makes it so appealing and so interesting, I think, and has led to a lot of the resurgence that we're seeing, because I think people really value things that have authenticity and that are handmade, and neon certainly is that.
I think about the neon signs that I've seen in my own lifetime and are still there. It doesn't seem, and it might be just because there are so few people that know what they're doing anymore with it, but it doesn't seem like a thing that's like new ones are going up a lot. It seems like they don't advertise the same way, unless what restaurant you have or what business you have is trying to go for a nostalgic look to it. Unless they're really going for that, demographic of people that appreciate, 50s, 40s, going back to the early part of the 20th century, facade to things or cosmetic. You don't see a lot of it, but what I do see, I think is fantastic. Like the kinds of things, the animations you could do with neon. We have one here on the seacoast of New England in New Hampshire called Yokin's, and Yokin's, the restaurant is long gone, but the sign is still there. There's a Five Guys in the plaza now, but the sign is still there. And at nighttime it lights up and the tail of the whale goes back and forth and there's water shooting out of its spout. And it's unique in that, like you said, New England and New Hampshire and everything is kind of chosen like, no, we're still stuck in the 1750s. But this is one of those, like, it's on Route 1. So it makes sense that they would have that, modern look to it, but it's like you can do some pretty incredible things with it. Question I don't even usually use for my podcast, because almost all art is very prescriptive. Like if you watch a movie or listen to a song, the artist wants you to feel a certain way while you're doing it. But with neon, would you say that is it still very prescriptive if a business decides to go with neon signage? I mean, sometimes it's just describing, the actual words are just describing what you're doing. Like parking, is like is something like that. But choosing between like a soft lighting on a hand painted sign versus neon, is there some prescription in that as far as they want to convey a certain thing about their business?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think as I was thinking about this before we were talking, I think there is certainly a prescriptive and a descriptive element to it. As you said, the words, and actually what you see a lot of now, the new neon that is being made, a lot of it is like text-based art that you'll see inside restaurants where there's no sign codes to restrict, which is one of the big reasons why we see a lot less of it out in the world, because of really restrictive sign codes. But even early on, you'd have neon if you're advertising for example, one of my favorite signs in Portland, Oregon, where I lived, is for the Portland Outdoor Store. They sell kind of Western wear, and so you have a cowboy. So it's like this. It's describing. Well, you have a shoe store. You're going to have a neon sign of a shoe. So in that case, you have descriptive. But yes, I mean the purpose of every neon sign, just like any sign, is to get somebody to stop and go into that store instead of the other store and buy something there, or park here instead of the other place, to catch the attention of the consumer. But yeah, to the question of especially kind of new neon or where you see it today, I think it certainly is a conscious choice because neon is handcrafted, because there are fewer artisans who have the skill to do it today. It is generally more expensive than alternatives. And LED, which I say with slight disdain, I think people ask, if you're replacing neon with LED, is that okay? And my answer is, well, it's better than losing the entire sign. Like in Boston, the Citgo sign has been replaced with LED lights. I'd rather have that than no sign at all. But LED is not neon. It has a very different feel and a very different look. It's much less environmentally friendly for a number of reasons. But it's a whole lot cheaper in the short term. It's just unfortunately, a lot of our throwaway culture today, it's LED is built with planned obsolescence. It's going to be cheap. You're going to have to replace it in a couple years. Neon costs a lot more on the front end, but can survive literally indefinitely if it's protected. There was a neon tube inside a building in Los Angeles that was lit in the 1920s that was then like covered up with siding, and when it was uncovered again a few years ago, it was still lit. It's still working. So it'll last forever. So it's more expensive. So it does, to get back to the specific question, it is a choice at this point by a business to, if they happen, like you said, with the Five Guys in the plaza, somebody decided, we love this sign. It's an icon of the community, as neon signs often are. We're going to keep this, and someone's going to pay to keep this lit, even though that's not our business. Or if it is a new business, you say, we want to convey a specific image of either nostalgia or authenticity. We have the resources to be able to do this, and we want to be kind of a step above and a step different from the people next door. So it is certainly conveying something and trying to say something about the business that uses it.
It works for me. I mean, I love how.
Yes.
I mean, neon cuts through the dark. It's like you can see it. It always sees, to me, it represents civilization. It represents development. It represents, commerce, everything that you would expect with, like a safe, well-working society. If you were, for some reason trapped in the middle of nowhere and you're trying to find and if you start seeing a neon light, I'm, this is good. This is developed. This is, where I need to be. This is going to find, like water here, the big neon light sign. But it's funny because I think I think about like It's a Wonderful Life, for example, when he's in alternate, Pottersville instead of Bedford Falls. They use neon as a way to convey like chintziness and cheap. And it's funny because you say it's actually pretty expensive. Maybe not so much in the 40s, but that's like their way of, instead of like a fine dining restaurant or a nice mom and pop, lunch counter or something like that, they are, girls, and, peep show and, all night dancing and stuff like that. That neon, seems to convey that as well. Even in that time, it was seen as kind of like the cheaper kind of business would use neon. But, so there's like, seems like there's been windows of time through the 20th and early 21st century where it doesn't mean that at all. Like when it was first being applied, we're talking early 20th century, right? Is when it was really being adopted a lot by businesses, in general. I don't think too many people had their house number, lit up in neon, like, hey, number 731.
Yeah.
Is there a person, is there one entity or a company that gets the credit for introducing neon for that reason?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll briefly interject that one of the many wonderful things I loved about Portland, Oregon is that they do occasionally use neon signs on their house numbers or on the apartment numbers. There were a number of apartment buildings that had just like right above the entrance, either the name of the apartment in neon or the address. And I've never seen it anywhere other than Portland. But there is at least one place where they do that. But and it's really interesting. You mentioned these cycles, because it really has gone in waves from being, a symbol of glamour, to a symbol of decay, to a symbol of nostalgia, and now kind of a symbol of authenticity, over 100 years or so that we've had neon signs. But yeah, there was, believe it or not, I mean, one company, that introduced neon originally. Neon, the gas wasn't discovered until the late 1800s. And so there were earlier attempts. We had signs obviously before that. We had illuminated signs before that. I mean, we put oil or like fire inside boxes essentially as signs in the 1800s. But there, even before neon, people were experimenting with carbon dioxide which emitted a little bit of light inside glass tubes as signage. And then obviously we had Edison's incandescent bulbs that were used for signage. And so neon comes around in the 19-teens. So there's an individual named Georges Claude, who was French, and he saw one of these early called Moore tubes, Moore, was the individual who was doing work with carbon dioxide in glass tubes, and Claude saw one of these displayed in Paris at a show, and thought there was potential here, and so was experimenting with different things, and he put the neon in the glass tube. in the early 19 teens, and then patented actually the electrode part of it. And so that was Claude's patent, the electrode that connected everything. And so he patented this in Paris and then tried to sell it to General Electric in the US, but they wouldn't take it. So Claude came over and started franchising Claude Neon name in the US starting in 1915. And so we don't know exactly when the first neon sign, to my knowledge, when or exactly where it was in the US, but very likely late teens or early 20s. We know that there were certainly a number of them by the early 20s. But yeah, so Claude Neon had a patent on neon signs until 1932 in the US, which doesn't mean that there weren't other neon signs. It just means that he spent a lot of time in court trying largely unsuccessfully to fight off others who were using this patent.
If it's a naturally occurring thing, it's kind of hard to tell people they didn't do it themselves and owe him some money for that. But I think all of this just really tells you, because I'm sure when he was developing that technology, it was for the purpose of commercial uses, right? He wasn't doing it just to, be like, we could make, and actually I've seen neon crosses, so it's not just for churches.
Right.
I've seen, like Las Vegas, you think picture that, or, somewhere like that. But like the drive, all those innovators in that same era seemed to be driven, being pushed or pulled, depending on how you want to look at it, by business. Business, especially in America, was so underregulated for the longest time. I think it's interesting that his patent expired, right at the beginnings of the Great Depression, when the government starts to really take over with a lot of, hands involved in the workings of business and trade and everything, where, talk about the right time, to come up with something like that, because especially coming after World War One, it's like that was just commercial paradise for American business people. Like we were the country that didn't see any fighting in our continent.
Right. We did really well.
Our infrastructure was intact. We were ready to get right back to business after, a short depression right after the war. And what better time to start marketing your signage? Like you can make, anything you want, words to get your customers to come to you for whatever you're selling using this neon. I think it's like this, if he had tried to bring it up, obviously the 30s would have been a terrible time for that, and beyond. But that was, but it always seems like it's the post World War II era that gets most of the neon. Like when people think of neon in popular culture, like we always think of like the diners of the 50s and the 60s, or 50s primarily, but that post World War II, that next huge boom in American business and economics is the 50s after World War II, and we always seem to kind of put neon with that as well. And I would surmise that it might be because in the 20s, not a lot of color photography, if any, so there wasn't, if you took a picture of a neon sign back then and held it forever, you're like, oh, it's a nice black and white image. Whereas color photography really, picks up with, after World War II. And, it's such a colorful era that I feel like the pictures that you take of neon really do it the justice it deserves. And that's probably why it has stuck with us as being, if you use neon now, like I was just at a diner, a mile from that Yokin's sign. The Roundabout Diner in Portsmouth a few weeks ago. And they use a lot of neon inside as well, because they are going for that 50s motif, right? They want that, look of a, 50s diner kind of thing. And so they use a lot of neon inside for that. And so it's like, it might have everything to do with just we don't have a lot of pictures of it being super colorful in the 20s. So, it brightened up then, but we don't know for sure unless you were around. But it definitely brightened up the after World War II era with a lot of the similar purposes for it, I'm sure.
Yeah. And part of it too is a lot of those early signs, they aren't around anymore. They tended to be small. You didn't need your signs to be as big and exuberant because people are getting around by walking. Or these signs are primarily in cities. You're walking, you're on the streetcar. So they're generally smaller signs. And then the 30s was actually the height. I mean, there were more neon plants factories operating in the 30s than any other time. So there was a lot going on in the 30s. There were like 2,000 plants or so, then down to less than 200 at this point. But those signs from that early period, businesses didn't survive the Depression, so those signs came down or decayed. There were a lot of mandatory blackouts during World War II, so a lot of those signs never got relit after World War II. And then there's this new, after the war, we want to start a new society and do new things. And so that older stuff kind of becomes less appealing because there's this really strong desire to start a new way of life. And then you have, white flight out of the cities and into the suburbs. And so for various reasons, those older signs, don't exist as much anymore. But then, as you said, in the 50s, we have car culture. People en masse are having disposable income and traveling. And it was a time where we celebrated excess and big things, and there was no regulation for these types of things. And when you're driving, obviously you're going 60 miles an hour, 40, 50, 60 miles an hour. You need your sign to be a whole lot bigger in order for someone to see it and decide to stop. And so that leads to, and people are traveling more. So this leads to these really big, these gorgeous, motels and the types of places that we often associate with neon signs, motels, drive-in theaters, bowling alleys, these types of things. This is the era when those things were really exploding across the landscape.
I wonder how many orders for no vacancy came across some of those neon factories in those days, because that's like the most common motel, the name of the motel, and then underneath they have, is it lit or not lit, I hope you enjoyed the first part of our conversation. Become a subscriber at patreon.com/EPS Podcast or epspodcast.substack.com to hear the second part several months early. Also, you heard that Jeremy is on the board of directors for the SCA and is organizing the group's biannual conference for later this spring. This year's conference is to be held in Erie, Pennsylvania, and at the time of this podcast, they are accepting presentation submissions for the next week or so. So if Roadside America is your forte and you want to be amused in the Alleghenies in a few months, register today over at SCA-roadside.org. Jeremy, thank you so much for joining the EPS podcast. And you were mentioning before the Society for Commercial Archaeology can be found at SCA.org, SCA-roadside.org, right?
That's right. Yep. Yeah. And also on Instagram and Facebook primarily. So lots of great coverage there. We try to post pretty regularly about what's happening in the roadside world. So please check it out.
Instagram is the place for that kind of stuff for sure. I've fallen in love with Instagram. I used to be a Facebook person, and now it's all Instagram because I just love the images with the caption. It's just like, I know that sounds kind of dull, but I like pictures. But the way that it's communicated so well, keeps with the spirit of what we were talking about for the last hour of neon
absolutely.
And catching one's eyes. So thanks for joining the EPS podcast, where everything, including neon and the Society for Commercial Archaeology, are primary sources. We'll talk to you next time.